the nation. And so you end up with, as we said, Moab looks at the situation and goes, now's as good a time as any to rebel and stop paying this tribute. And so Jehoram doesn't want to stop receiving tribute, so he talks to Jehoshaphat and says, will you go fight with me? Because he does not want that tribute to stop, because that will further weaken him. And then whoever else he might be controlling and be getting tribute from, they might see that. I mean, one king is going to see, well, he rebelled and nothing happened, and now they're even weaker because they don't have, or they have. So he couldn't let this stand, or it was going to weaken him to the point that he couldn't do anything. Okay, so he asked for help from Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat will start his interest physically to go to war with Jehoram.
Good to join forces with an ungodly country, and certainly he was putting himself as a godly country at risk with Jehoram and all of his
self. And so from a purely physical standpoint, it would make sense, though, to go put down this rebellion, because it gives I would guess Moab was probably still paying tribute to Judah. Now, I don't know that, but I would think that they were. But, it does well to project strength. And so this would project strength. And so it might seem to Jehoshaphat that it would make sense, and it would be a good idea to align yourself and go do this. But turn over to 2 Chronicles. We're going to see that Jehoshaphat is pretty dense. He should have already learned his lesson in allying himself with evil people. 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Verse 35, it says, after this, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, allied himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who acted very wickedly. And he allied himself with him to make ships to go to Tarshish, and they made the ships in Ezion-Geber. But Eleazar, the son of Dodavah of Mareshah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because you have allied yourself with Ahaziah, the Lord has destroyed your works. Then the ships were wrecked so that they were not able to go to Tarshish. So Ahaziah was before Jehoram, right? He allied himself with Ahaziah, and his ships were wrecked. And this wasn't something where the guy could say, maybe it was just coincidence that my ships got wrecked. A prophet came and said, this is why your ships are getting wrecked, because you're allying yourself. He seems pretty couple of years he's doing this, and so it seems he just doesn't get it. So next, Jehoram, by which way shall we go up? And he, Jehoshaphat, answered, and they marched on that roundabout route 7 days, and there was no water for the army, nor for the animals that followed them. And so, I don't have it up there, but I mentioned here, the plan of attack was not wise. It says in verse 9, why it wasn't wise. Why was that? Brother Al, what's a MRE? That's what these animals were. I mean, if you're in an army going to war, you got to carry it. Meat's going to spoil if you kill it and pack it, unless you smoke it somehow. So this was, MREs on the hoof is what I see these as. And so, you got to take them. They also had to do something else too, and that was sacrifice. Because, let's see, what verse was it? I was looking to see. There was one verse that mentions the grain offering, and I didn't write it down, and I should have. Somebody finds that reading ahead, let me know. Was it verse 20? Yes. Now it happened in the morning when the grain offering was offered. So they were, they were still trying to follow some of God's laws, and so some of these animals might have been intended just as sacrifices before battle or whatever. But I think the main purpose of taking them was either they were riding them into battle or they were going to eat them. And so all these three kings together to deliver them into. And so in studying for the class tonight, I looked in a study Bible, and it said there was an ancient Moabite stone that was found in the 1800s or so. And on this Moabite, click over this map. I don't know if y'all can see that or not. So Moab well, I'd imagine there's probably nothing alive in it. I've never been there, but I've been to the Great Salt Lake, and I think the only thing in it is brine shrimp. There's no fish, there's no nothing. And so you couldn't drink that. But according to that stone, there was a pretty heavy armed presence that Moab maintained on the north, and almost none on the south. Why would you not maintain anything on the south side? Because it's desert, and nobody's dumb enough to try to attack you from the desert, except Jehoshaphat, who we've established is dense, and Jehoram, who is desperate. And so they are trying something that really was foolish. And so Jehoram realizes quickly that they've made a serious error in their plan of attack. And so let me go back here. All right. So they realized they were in trouble. And so we'll pick up the reading with verse 11. But Jehoshaphat said, "Is there no prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of the Lord by him?" So one of the servants of king of Israel answered and said, "Elisha the son of Shaphat is here, who poured water on the hands of Elijah." And Jehoshaphat said, "The word of the Lord is with him." So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. And Elisha said to the king of Israel, so these three guys come, and he looks at the king of Israel and says, "What have I to do with you? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother," which would have been the prophets of Baal. But the king of Israel said, "No, for the Lord has called these three kings to deliver them into the hand of Moab." Elisha said, "As the Lord of hosts liveth, before whom I stand, surely were it not that I regard the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look at you nor see you. But now bring me a musician." So why is it that Elisha regards Jehoshaphat? We've just talked about that God was not necessarily with Jehoshaphat because of him allying himself with evil people. But Elisha says something that's a little bit different than that when he says, "I wouldn't..." Brother Dick?
Judah at this time is still, and Jehoshaphat, of course, was the king.
Okay. And those are all correct. They were still this.
Introducing him, it says that the Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the former ways of his father David. He didn't seek the Baals, but sought the God of his father and walked by his. Very, put it very horribly. He's faithful. Therefore, a man of God's going to revere him.
And the biggest reason is he's of the lineage of David, and that lineage has to survive so that Jesus can come through that. And if you go back to that chart, there were 9 different families, if we want to call them that. All the kings of Judah came through one family, and that was David, because that's what God had promised, that David, the Messiah is going to come through your family, through. The alliance defeats Moab, and Mesha sacrifices his son to king. We will read the part here where water is provided. And so Elisha says this in verse 16, "Thus says the Lord, make this valley full of ditches." And so it's just really hard on them to do anything. And it happened in the morning when the grain offering was offered that suddenly water came by way of Edom, and the land was filled with water. And when all the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them, all who were able to bear arms and older were gathered, and they stood at the border. And then they rose up early in the morning, and the sun was shining on the water, and the Moabites saw water on the other side as red as blood. And they said, this is blood. The kings have surely struck swords and have killed one another. Now therefore Moab to the spoil. Would this have been common back then for an alliance to break down and them kill each other? I mean, it was, wasn't it? We read about it all the time. I mean, these were fragile alliances at best, because these groups of people were really tribal, and tribal people, they're really loyal to their tribe and not really loyal to anybody else. We may cooperate today, but I might be insulted tomorrow and we'll kill each other. I mean, that's just the way that it was. And so this was not an unreasonable thing for the king of Moab to presume that, they got mad at one another and killed each other. Let's go steal all their stuff. Well, they're all dead. All that they fled back to. It says in verse 25, they left the stones of Kir-Hareseth intact, which is a city. And it says in verse 26, and when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords, trying to break through to the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his eldest son, who would have reigned in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel. So they departed from him and returned to their own land. So he's been defeated. In desperation, he sacrifices his oldest son to Chemosh, which I'm assuming is some kind of a fire god, because, he burns his son. So Chemosh is mentioned, if you want to look. I'm not going to go there for sake of time. He's mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 7 and 33. And in that situation, it was actually Solomon who set up a worshiping place, Chemosh. So at this time, he had already started to turn away from God. And then it's mentioned again in 2 Kings 23:13, and I will turn there. 2 Kings 23, verse 13. And this is talking about Josiah. Then the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, which were on the south of the Mount of Corruption, which saw the abomination of the Moabites, and for Milcom the abomination of the people of Ammon. So Chemosh is well known to the people at this time, and so, that was the Moabite god. So he thought sacrificing his own son to that god would bring them victory. It ultimately did not. And so, that's where this sort of ends, talking about the kings of Israel. And then we have this, I told Clay, it was an interlude of Elisha for several chapters, where we don't really talk about one king to the next, but we talk about Elisha and a lot of the things he was doing. So any questions or thoughts, comments up to now?
About they're going to battle against Moab. Well, and you got the lineage of David with Jehoshaphat, but you also have the lineage of Christ in a Moabite woman named Ruth, and so it's kind of interesting how those two things come together about this time.
Oh yeah, and it's not long, I guess. There's several of those kinds of things, aren't there? Anything else?
God, because as we pointed out earlier, what person in the right mind is going to attack from the desert where there's no water, and yet who still won?
Right.
I mean, there ain't no way that was not that working of the Lord. I don't think anybody can tell you different.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this was a really stupid plan of attack. I mean, had it not been for God intervening, they would all died of thirst in the desert, and it would have actually been, as Moab thought, Moab to the spoil, if they wanted to go into that area to try to get it. But Just the whole situation. I mean, dig some ditches and you're going to see them fill up with water. How amazing would that be? I mean, you had to have some amount of faith to dig those ditches, didn't you? You're already hot and thirsty and your animals are probably starting to die. And Elisha says, get down here and not dig a ditch, but says fill the land with ditches. So they dug ditches everywhere. And they all filled up with water, which, it kind of harkens back to some of the things that Elijah did, where he poured water all over that sacrifice, and then the fire from God came down and licked up even the water that was in the trench around the sacrifice. And so, just really amazing things that are talked about here. Okay, moving on to chapter 4. We're going to move quickly. We might finish this, we might not. So Elisha has been established as a prophet. I mean, it's obvious from Jehoshaphat's statement there in verse 12 of chapter 3, I believe. Yeah, the word of the Lord is with him. Whenever Elisha was mentioned, he knew. And so, confirming that he has power from God and therefore should be listened to when he prophesies, we see 4 miracles here in chapter 4. The first one, beginning in verse 1, it says, a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves. So Elisha said, what shall I do for you? Tell me what to do. What do you have in the house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil. Then he said, go borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons. Then pour it into all those vessels and set aside the full ones. So she went from him and shut the door behind her, and her sons who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Now it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, bring me another. And he said to her, there is not another vessel. So the oil ceased. And then she came out, and Elisha said, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest. So I'm going to make the point a little bit later about some kind of, I guess, similarities or things that Jesus did. This sort of brings to mind the miracle of the water turning to wine. I mean, you have jars of water, bring me these jars and fill them up, and it becomes, but also he tells her, when you have come in, shut the door behind you and your sons. I didn't look it up, and I should have. Several times I remember Jesus going into a house to do a miracle and shutting the door behind him because he didn't want anybody else coming in. And one in particular is when he raised, I think it was Jairus' daughter. He went in and he shut the door. And so just things like that you notice when you're reading these. But this miracle directly mimics one of Elijah. And so that one was in 1 Kings, and I'm sure that Landon covered it a few weeks ago. Which one was that? It's in 1 Kings 17. It was another widow, and it's in verse 12. So Elijah has proclaimed a drought, and this widow, she says to him, he comes and asks for a morsel of bread, and she says in verse 12, as the Lord God lives, I did not have bread, only a handful of flour and a little oil in a jar. And what happens? He says, do not fear, go as you had, and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first and bring it to me. And so he tells her, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor the jar of oil run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth. So just like Elijah made one jar of flour and one jar of oil last for, the drought was 3 years. So, can you imagine that? Every day you go and there's there's still flour. I thought I used it all up yesterday, but there's still more in it. And so this is a similar type situation. She takes a jar of oil and starts pouring it and pouring it and pouring it. And it fills up all these containers, so much so that she was able to pay off all her debt and live on what was left, selling it. That's an amazing amount of oil. Okay, thoughts on that one, that miracle? Okay. The Shunammite's son, beginning in verse 8. Now it happened one day that Elisha went to Shunem, where there was a notable woman, and she persuaded him to eat some food. So as it was, as often as he passed by, he would turn in there to eat some food. And she said to her husband, "Look now, I know that this is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly. Let us make a small upper room on the wall, and let us put a bed in there for him, and a table and a chair and a lampstand. So it will be, whenever he comes, he can turn in there." And so she does this kindness for Elisha. He travels through here often, and there's no hotel, so he turns in there occasionally. And just out of the goodness of her heart, they build him a room to stay in as he's passing through. And so in order to, can he do for her, and she doesn't really want anything, so he tells her that she'll have a son. And so he must have known that she wanted a son, because that was a thing that was shameful for a woman in this time, to not have any children, to be barren. And so he prophesied that she would have a son, and she was so ecstatic, she said, "Do not lie to your maidservant," in verse 16. And then verse 17 says, "But the woman conceived and bore a son when the appointed time had come, of which Elisha had told her." And so we read on, the child begins to grow, and one day he complains of a headache. And in verse 20, he goes and he's laying in his mother's lap, and then he dies. And she went up in verse 21 and laid him on the bed of the man of God, shut the door upon him, and went out. And she called her husband and said, "Please send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come back." And he thinks she's going because it's some holy day. He says there in verse 23, "Why are you going to him today? It's neither the new moon or the Sabbath." And she said, "It is well, so everything's okay. Just get me a donkey, do what I said, and bring it here." So she goes to Elijah and asks him to, or tells him the situation. Or she goes to him and says in verse 28, "Did I ask a son of you? Did I not say, do not deceive me?" So she's in distress because this child has died. And so, that's kind of a cruel thing to say to Elisha, isn't it? "I told you not to do this," And so Elisha says to Gehazi, "Get yourself ready and take my staff in your hand and be on your way. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not answer him, but lay my staff on the face of the child." And the mother of the child said, "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So he arose and followed her. So he sent Gehazi, but she wasn't leaving unless Elijah came. And so he got up and he went with her. But Gehazi went on ahead, laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went back to meet him and told him, "The child has not awakened." When Elisha came into the house, there was the child laying dead on his bed. And he went in, therefore, shut the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay on the child, and put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. He returned and walked back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on him. Then the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. And he called Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite woman." So he called her, and when she came in, he said, "Pick up your son." So she went in and fell at his feet and bowed to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. And so, again, this calls to mind another miracle of Elisha, where he raised a boy from the dead. And how did he do it? He laid down on the child, didn't he? Why do they do that? I mean, that's a question. I'm just asking. I mean, why not just say, "Arise"? Why go through this laying down on them? And you know, when I was reading this, Mike, what's the name of the song where it talks about Jesus beginning to breathe in the tomb? Whenever I read that the child became warm, I thought about that song. What's that song? Living Hope. And so there's a line in it that talks about Jesus taking that first breath, arising from the dead. And, you know, you said it gives you chills to think about it, and it does me as well. And so, same thing here. You got a dead child. I don't know how long a period of time between when he died and when Elisha comes back, but he's already grown cold because it says he began to get warm again. And I mean, that just imagine that. And so I don't know why they lay down on them and do all of that, but there has to be some reason why they do it. Okay, questions or thoughts? Comments? The miracle of Elijah raising the child is in 1 Kings chapter 17 as well. If you want to go look that up. Yes?
They buried the man that had died, and his bones, they buried him on top of Elisha. When he touched them, he came.
Yes. And that's going to be in a few weeks from now. We'll talk about that. Again, a demonstration that Elisha was a powerful, powerful prophet. And it wasn't his corpse. The way I read that, it was his bones. So he had already decayed to nothing but bones when this happened. And they laid this dead man in. They were in a hurry. They were going to bury him, and there were raiders coming, and so they just threw him in the tomb with, we'll throw him in here and come back later. And when he touched Elisha's bones, he arose.
A lot of interesting things there. All we really remember that Gehazi for is what we'll study next week, I assume.
Yeah.
And Naaman there, but he doing what he's told, going here, going there, following command. And then the parallels between, Gehazi's the one that spotted the fact that she didn't have a son and her husband was old.
Yeah.
And he pointed that out to Elisha. So there's a parallel. Abraham and Sarah were old.
Yes.
And, don't mess with me.
Oh, I know. Yeah. I mean,
I'm gonna have a son.
Right. I mean, that would be something like that's really hard to believe. I mean, so all right. So these last two are pretty short. One thing I failed to point out about the widow is she was the widow of one of Elisha's servants. She says, "Your servant, my husband," and it calls him the son. About that term, sons of the prophets, basically meant they were a disciple of a prophet. And so this man who died and left that widow was a disciple of Elisha. And so who was Elisha a disciple of? Elijah. And now we have Gehazi, who is a disciple of Elisha. And so that's just kind of how it worked in this society is you found a master, a teacher, and you followed them and you learned from them. And so that's what these sons of the prophets were. And I failed to point that out, and I had it in my notes and I just overlooked it. Okay, So verse 38, Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was famine in the land. Now the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, and he said to his servant, Put on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. So one went out into the field to gather herbs, and found a wild vine, and gathered from it a lapful of wild gourds, and came and sliced them into the pot of stew, though they did not know what they were. Then they served it to the men to eat, and it happened as they were eating the stew that they cried out, There's death in the pot. So we'll cover this real quickly next week at the beginning of class, because there's a couple of points I want to make. I thought we went to 5 till. I thought I had 5 more minutes. Yeah.